This conference will now be recorded.
Hi guys, welcome and thank you so much for joining me today for a recorded encore presentation of our Ready, Set, Grow Gardening 101 talk. I really love to garden in my free time, and so I'm certainly happy to pass along any tips and tricks that I've learned over the years. Great timing certainly, as well, as we are right in the middle of spring and looking forward to a nice garden season. So I'm just going to go ahead here and toggle over to our PowerPoint presentation, and we'll get started. All right, excellent. So again, Ready, Set, Grow, Gardening 101. Really, I hope what you'll get out of today is, if you are a beginner gardener, somebody who's been thinking about trying it, but maybe has been a little bit intimidated or just not sure where to start, that you've got the tools basically that you need to get going, to have confidence and to have a healthy garden. And if you're somebody who has been gardening, I hope that you can pick up, again, some tips and tricks, maybe some suggestions, plant ideas from this presentation today. All right, so talking a little bit about why we might take up gardening. Certainly, it's an enjoyable way for us to get outside. Can help us to be more physically active. We're walking around the yard, we're picking up buckets, moving, bending, lifting, reaching. Definitely a great way to keep yourself moving. I think it really increases our appreciation for nature and the environment. This can be a great activity that we can do with our family and or with kids. There are lots of plants that are really easy and enjoyable to grow. On the other hand, we all love our families very much, but if you're looking for something that you can do to have a little time for yourself, gardening is also a great opportunity for that. I know that especially right now with the stay-at-home order, a lot of us are spending a lot more time together than we might be used to. If suddenly you're noticing how much more your spouse chews or breathes, you're not alone. Again, consider something like this to just get yourself out of the house and have that alone time. Gardening is a great way to reduce stress. I really like to garden because to me, it's almost like meditating. It helps me to just really block out any external thoughts I have going on, any distractions, any worries, and focus on just caring for the plants that I have in my yard. Can definitely be productive as well. You might have items that you can harvest. If you're growing flowers, you might be able to cut those for bouquets or other uses. You can harvest fruits, vegetables, herbs, all sorts of great stuff like that. And certainly, last but not least, especially with that stress reduction piece, gardening is something that really can improve our overall well-being. I think we're just starting to really take stress a lot more seriously in terms of its prominence as a risk factor for many chronic diseases. So anything that we can do, like gardening, that gets us moving more and can help to reduce our stress can be really good for us in a total sense. So gardening can take on many forms. We can garden in containers, we can garden inside with houseplants, so we can grow vegetables, cut flowers, herbs. We can venture into cacti or succulent gardening, or xeriscaping, which really means creating a garden landscape that requires minimal to no water. Basically, the point behind this slide is that there are garden options for any space, any budget, and any interest that you might have. So don't feel like you're limited just because you don't have a big yard, you're constrained on space, you don't want to spend a lot of money, or you have unique interests. There's something out there for you. So just a couple of pictures, samples of in-ground beds, some container gardening, and some raised beds down in the corner here. So let's work through some definitions. Some of you are probably familiar with what these things are, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Annuals are plants that are going to complete their life cycle in one growing season. So they're going to make flowers, they're going to disperse seeds, and then those individual plants are going to die off. But possibly if they're sowing seeds, you'll have other plants come back next year. Perennials are plants that live for 2 or more years. Biennials are plants that have a 2-year life cycle. So these plants are going to create foliage in their first season only, and then they're going to create flowers the second year. They set seed after they flower, and then those individual plants die off as well. Bulbs and tubers are plants that store energy in underground organs. Basically, that organ is what we think of as the bulb or the tuber. Natives are species that are indigenous to an area. Invasive plants are species that grow aggressively. They may displace other existing plants and actually entire ecosystems. So not always a good thing. I think of, for example, the purple loosestrife. If anybody's been driving along the roads and you see these little spikes of purple flowers, that grow up in wet areas next to the sides of the roads. This is actually an invasive that's overtaken where cattails used to grow. And so that's something that a lot of our local ecologists pay attention to. Weeds, I also like to mention, weeds are not actually a real category of plant. We tend to use the word weed as more of a descriptor, based on basically the way a plant acts, its habits, and also our perceptions of that plant. So things like clover, dandelions. A lot of times we tend to refer to things as weeds that are growing in our turf grass or lawns that we don't want to grow there. So thinking about considerations as you start to decide what you want to put in your space, there are a lot of different things that we want to consider. So the first one's going to be our light conditions. So we're not only talking about the amount of light that an area gets on a daily basis, but also on a seasonal basis. A great example might be an area that's surrounded by trees or that's underneath a tree. In the spring, that area might seem like it's a really sunny, open spot, but as summer comes on, the leaves on those trees fill in, suddenly it's a really shady area. So you just want to be observant of those cycles. So full sun is going to describe plants that like at least 6 hours of direct sunlight each day. Part shade can be anywhere from 2 to 5 hours of light per day. And then full shade is less than 2 hours of direct sunlight. So you'll notice that even though it says full shade, that's a little bit of a misnomer because those plants still want a little bit of light throughout the day. We're also going to want to think about the type of soil we have. Is it sandy, loamy, clay-like? What's the acidity or the pH of the soil? We're going to talk a little more about soil in the coming slides as well. Water levels and drainage, proximity to other plants, exposure and sloping ground, what our general space availability is like, and then also time and maintenance needs. Especially if you're getting started, I always recommend start small. See what you really want to dedicate and what you have to dedicate for available time, and how much effort you want to take into caring for your plants. One of the biggest things I can stress as we go through today in terms of talking about a healthy garden, one of the best things we can do for plants is really just to try to meet all of their basic requirements. If we're taking a plant that enjoys full sun and we're planting it in a really shady area, it's going to be really difficult for that plant to thrive and be healthy. The same thing for any of these other conditions. Some plants are a little bit more tolerant about being in conditions that are not most optimal for them, but some are pretty particular. So talking about amending our soil, this is something many of us have to do to get good soil in our garden beds. Here in New Hampshire, we tend to have a lot of sand and a lot of rocks. It's very compact soil. The thing we want to think about with soil is it almost functions as a digestive organ for our plants. The soil is essentially where all of the breakdown of the nutrients is going to happen so that the nutrients can be made into a small enough form that the plant can use. So we want to make sure the soil has organic content, that the soil isn't really compact. If we want to have places basically for water and oxygen to be able to penetrate through the soil to help assist with some of those breakdown reactions. So basically look at your soil composition. Sandy soil is going to tend to be really loose, granular, grainy. It's not going to form a ball when you try to squeeze it in your fist. Clay-like soil is going to feel cool, wet. When you form a ball, it's going to be really hard to break that ball back apart. Loamy soil, which is our ideal soil for most types of plants. Again, it's going to be light, it's going to be loose, it's going to be filled with organic matter. You can make a ball or form a ball with it, but it's going to easily break back apart when you try to bust apart that ball. So all soil types can benefit from the addition of compost. Compost is essentially decomposed or broken down organic materials. So oftentimes we see this from manure, worm castings, or we can even make compost at home with kitchen scraps and other things that are around the yard. Compost is beneficial in that it's really rich in microbial life. So those microbes are going to, again, help to break down the organic matter that's in the soil so that plants can use it. Compost does provide some nutrients, but it doesn't replace fertilizer. And that's actually not where the value of compost is. It's not in being a fertilizer, but again, it's facilitating essentially all of those chemical reactions to make nutrients available for plants. Raised beds or container gardens, great place to start if you really have poor soil. It can be pretty backbreaking work to try to make a brand new in-ground bed if you don't have good soil to start with. If you're really not sure what your soil is like, what the content is like, the acidity, the nutrient content, you can actually have your soil tested through UNH Cooperative Extension. So they're a really great local resource. They're actually right here in Goffstown. They will test your soil. You can send them a little bag. I think it's 20 bucks per sample, but later in the presentation under other resources, I do have their website listed as well. So if you have more questions about that, you can certainly go there and check that out. All right, so let's talk about feeding our plants. There are tons and tons of different types of fertilizers out there. So let's demystify it a little bit. So generally when we look at a bag, bottle, container of fertilizer, one of the most important things we're trying to identify is going to be called our NPK ratio. This stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are essentially the three major nutrients that plants need to be healthy. Nitrogen is what's responsible for the leafy green growth on the plant. Phosphorus is going to help with root and bud and flower development. And then potassium is an important nutrient to help with the plant's metabolic processes. So kind of knowing what those different nutrients do for plants, we can understand maybe how different plants might have different optimal ratios for those nutrients. Some plants actually even like different blends, different ratios as they go throughout the growing season. I'll use the example of tomatoes. Early when I'm starting my tomatoes off, I'll tend to give them a fertilizer that has maybe a little bit more nitrogen in it. It's still pretty balanced, but a little higher on that N number, so that the plant will form, again, lots of leafy growth, really thick, beefy green stalks. As soon as the tomatoes start to set any buds and develop any fruit, I'm going to switch over to a fertilizer that has a little more phosphorus in it to help promote that type of growth. If you're hearing all of this and thinking, oh man, do I need to have 19 different fertilizers out in my garage? You do not. It's definitely better to fertilize your plants with something than to not fertilize them at all. So if you prefer to keep it a little bit simpler, look for something that's an all-purpose blend. It's going to have a pretty even mix of all of these nutrients and be a good kind of jack of all trades for your different plants. So looking at organic and chemical fertilizers. So organic fertilizers are going to use natural ingredients and they're going to break down a little bit more slowly. Because of that, they're far less likely to burn or over-fertilize plants. They're going to tend to contain trace minerals and other beneficial microorganisms. Again, we like that microorganic life in this case because it's going to help to break down the nutrients so the plants can use them. Generally, these types of fertilizers are a little bit safer for people, pets, and the environment. Do note that things like bone meal and blood meal can attract predatory or scavenging animals. So if you know there's a lot of critter activity in the area where you live, you might want to either steer away from those types of fertilizer or look for them coming in a liquid form. A lot of these things are available in a liquid form and won't have the same effect on predators. So again, both organic fertilizers come in both liquid and dry forms. Looking at chemical fertilizers, these are formulated to be uptaken really quickly by plants. You definitely want to make sure not to apply chemical fertilizers to the roots of the plant or right near the roots of the plant, because it can actually burn the plants. We also want to be careful with runoffs. Think about where, if you're watering an area that you fertilized, where is that water going to go? Handle with care around pets and small children, again, same reason. And chemical fertilizers do come in both liquid and dry forms. I think you guys can probably tell I've got a little bit of a bias here on what types of fertilizer I like to use, but there is a time and a place for chemical fertilizers. If you have a plant that really needs a quick, immediate dose of nutrition, maybe it's unhealthy, chemical fertilizers might be a better way to go. So thinking about watering our plants, for in-ground plants, I mean, we really want to make sure to monitor rainfall. Generally, in-ground plants want to be watered once or twice a week so that the ground is saturated to about a 6-inch depth. If we're getting at least an inch of rainfall each week, that's probably going to cover most of your watering needs. For containers, we want to make sure that containers have a drainage hole. That's really important. Just as much as we want the plant to get water, we want to make sure that it's not sitting in water. That can cause a lot of rot and other types of problems. I would recommend to check the soil in your containers physically versus watering your containers on a schedule. Containers, depending on the environmental conditions, they can dry out more quickly. Individual containers, depending on their size and what they have in them, can dry out more or less quickly. So don't make an assumption that because one container is dry, they all need water, or vice versa. You do want to check them. You're going to want to water enough so that water runs out of the bottom of the container. Sometimes for a large container, that can be quite a bit of water. I think that can be a little surprising for us. Make sure, try not to let your soil in your containers totally dry out. I'm sure we've all had the experience where we do accidentally forget to water something for a bit, and when you go back to water it, the soil has basically pulled away from the edges of the container. The challenge we run into then is that when you go to try to water it, the water is going to run off of the top of that dry brick of soil, right down those open sides and out the pot, and not really saturate the root ball anymore. If you do have that happen and the container is small enough, what I might suggest is to actually submerge the entire pot in a giant bucket of water until all of the air bubbles start coming out. That's going to help to really rehydrate that soil if it's dried out. For annual flowers, add liquid fertilizer every other week. For continuous blooms, that is a general that every other week statement. Obviously, you would want to look at the recommended feeding directions on the back of your specific fertilizer that you have, but do make sure you're fertilizing, especially in a container situation. The flowers are going to use up any nutrients in there pretty quickly, and if you do want to have nice color for many, many weeks, make sure you're fertilizing. When we're watering, try to make sure that you're watering near plant bases versus overhead. When we tend to use like a hose on a shower setting and just kind of spray over a garden bed, we're actually not going to get the water where we want it. A lot of the water is going to end up on the leaves of the plant, where it could contribute to some fungal issues and not necessarily actually saturate the soil around the plant. Do also be careful. While we want to water underneath the plant, you don't want to water directly on the crown of the plant. Doing that consistently, again, can cause some fungus and rot issues in that area. All right, so thinking about, do we start with seeds or do we get plants that we can transplant? There are benefits to both. So growing plants from seed can definitely be rewarding and fun. To me, that is one of the most magical things about gardening, is to take this little tiny seed that looks like it's inert, it's lifeless. You plant it and all of a sudden it turns into a really beautiful plant. It's pretty cool. Growing plants from seeds can be cost effective. It allows us to have a lot more variety to choose from, all sorts of heirlooms, less common varieties than what we can get in our local nurseries. It does also mean that we'll know exactly how the seedlings were grown and cared for because we did it. Transplanting plants can help you to create a more full, lush look quickly. Obviously, growing things from seed takes a little bit more time. Plants are going to start out smaller. We can get things from nurseries that are at peak or at full size or are close to it. We can enjoy plants that are maybe a little more challenging to grow from seed this way. And it also helps us to support smaller local businesses if we purchase from our neighborhood nursery and not a box store. So when we're planting seeds, just a few tips here. Obviously, follow the seed packet guidelines if you have one. You want to make sure that you're noting which seeds must be direct sown and which should be started early and transplanted, especially when you're first purchasing your seeds. If you only have a plan to start things outside, just make sure that you're flipping the packages over and that you're not getting any that require being started indoors 4 to 8 weeks early, though that is certainly a fun thing to do as well and could be a totally separate presentation topic, starting seeds indoors. Seedlings are generally going to do best in a light, sterile seedling starter mix. Obviously, for plants that we're direct sowing out in the garden, we aren't necessarily going to use a specific mix. It's probably the soil that's right in the bed, but make sure that the soil in that area wherever you are sowing seeds is, again, rich in organic matter, nice and light and loose, gives plenty of ability for those young roots on that baby plant to spread out and thrive. Generally, we want to sow seeds twice as deep as their diameter. So if for some reason you don't have a seed packet, that's a good rule of thumb to function by. We're going to put several seeds in each planting hole. And then once you've got your seedlings germinated and each seedling has a couple of sets of true leaves, you'd want to thin down to just one in that particular spot. We want to make sure as well to keep soil consistently moist until seeds do germinate. So transplanting plants, some tips for having that go successfully for you. You want to make sure to dig a hole as twice as wide and at least as deep as your plant's pot. We're going to remove the plant from the pot. You want to inspect and loosen the roots of the root ball as you need to. One of my favorite ways to transplant plants is basically to take the pot, kind of like what we were talking about doing for a pot that's completely dried out. I'm going to submerge it in a bucket of water until I see all of the air bubbles have stopped popping up. And then I'm going to go ahead and just gently massage the root ball of the plant to help loosen things up. I find that to be a really gentle way just to tease some of the roots apart. If you end up with a plant that is really root bound, you take it out of the container and all the roots are growing together in the bottom, that can be a great way to manage that and have the roots root into the ground successfully for you. Most plants are going to sit at soil level. There are some notable exceptions. Tomatoes or any other members of the nightshade family like peppers do actually like to be planted a little bit deeper. You can plant any of those plants basically right up to the first set of lower leaves, and they'll form new roots out of the stem. So it helps to improve the root system and also to give that plant a really nice beefy stem as well. Roses are another one that like to be planted just a little bit lower than the height of their crown. If you're using fertilizer, mix at the recommended rate into the soil of your planting hole. You want to gently firm soil back around the plant. Water well after planting and then regularly afterwards to ensure good establishment. So plants that you've just transplanted in really are going to need probably a little bit of extra care and attention throughout the season compared to plants that have been there, perennials maybe that you've had in the yard for quite a while. Some plants are going to take longer to establish or just don't like being moved. So don't think that a plant has died or isn't going to make it if it looks a little harshed on, even for the entire season after you first transplant it. That is not uncommon. Peonies are a really great example. They're so beautiful. They're just about maintenance free once established, but peonies can take 3 or 4 years to bloom after they've been moved. So again, don't assume that something is at the end of its time if it's not really active or really beautiful right away after you've planted it. So moving into what is definitely one of my favorite parts of the presentation. So we're going to cruise through some different slides showing examples of plants that are really easy to grow and or are beneficial for our pollinators. There are so many different types of plants I could have chosen to show you here, but I decided to stick with those. Again, easy to grow, great for bees, because how can you go wrong, right? So coming back to our annuals, like we said, these are plants that complete their life cycle in one growing season. They're typically going to be propagated by seeds, whether that's the plant goes to seed at the end of its cycle and it self-sows, or we're planting seeds. Many types of flowers that we enjoy growing, as well as vegetables, are annuals. Annuals can have varying degrees of hardiness, which basically just means how much cold they can tolerate. Can they handle a light frost, a hard frost, and how many days of that before they're going to die? Annuals typically are going to be better suited to living in containers because they tend to have shallower root systems. So they're not going to feel so cramped in a container space as most of our perennials might. As a general rule, again, our annuals really like that loamy soil, lots of nutrients, and they're going to want regular watering. So classic favorite right here, right? Sunflowers. So many beautiful different varieties. Sunflowers are really, really easy to grow from seed. It's a nice big seed that's easy for kids to handle too. So this is a great one to do as a family. Sunflowers do not like to be transplanted. They also don't like to live in containers. Maybe the one exception to that would be, here's a picture here of this teddy bear sunflower up at the top. Those are a little bit smaller of a sunflower with a less developed root system, and so they might do okay in containers. But for the most part, you're going to want to direct sow these guys in the grounds where they're going to live for the season. They're going to bloom in mid to late summer. They attract tons of different types of pollinators, and you can grow them for flowers that you can enjoy and or for seeds. Nasturtiums, another really easy to grow large seed that attracts pollinators. Also a great companion plant. So companion plants refer to those that have helpful, beneficial aspects for other plants we might grow them near. So with regards to vegetables and roses, nasturtiums can act like a sacrificial plant. Aphids really, really love nasturtiums and will leave other plants alone in favor of snacking on your nasturtiums. So they can be a good way to draw some of those pest insects away. Nasturtiums also have low to no fertilizer needs. They actually help to improve the nitrogen content of the soil around them. Petunias, another great companion plant, also easy to grow from seed. These come in a wide array of colors. I just love this one up in that right-hand corner. Kind of looks like a fuchsia galaxy, so pretty. These are also going to repel small-bodied insects that can wreak havoc on our plants. They bloom for a really long time throughout the season, and you don't need to deadhead them. Some plants, in order to continue pumping out flowers, require that you cut off the spent blooms. Petunias are not one of them. Many varieties of petunia will also easily reseed, so you can have the same area filled with petunias year after year. Zinnias, another one that's easy to grow from seed. Another one, there are tons and tons of varieties available. You can get 6-foot tall zinnias. You can get 6-inch tall zinnias. So there are zinnias to fit basically any space in your garden. They're another one that's going to bloom a little bit later in the season, giving you some nice color at the end of the summer and into early fall. Can't forget shade annuals. Coleus, it does make a flower, but really the draw for Coleus is that it has colorful, variegated, fun foliage that we can enjoy all season. This one is easy to grow from seed, or you can transplant as well. Let's look at a few perennials now. So perennials, again, are plants that are going to live for 2 or more growing seasons. These are generally going to propagate somewhat by seed, but more so by runners or rhizomes. Individual plants will start to branch out over time. So this includes many varied types of plants, ground covers, shrubs, etc. Perennials are described as having hardiness zones. So this again has to do with how cold of temperatures they can tolerate living down to. So plants that are only hardy in warmer zones are often described as tender perennials. So up here in New Hampshire, we are generally in this area about zone 5. So if we plant plants that are above our zone 7 to 10, for example, there are a few different types of lilies that are common, canna lilies, things like that. Those are going to either die back if we leave them outside in the winter, or maybe we can overwinter them indoors. But oftentimes we tend to treat them like annuals and just have them for the one season. Perennials can also be evergreen, or they can die back in the winter. So some plants will have foliage of some sort all through the year. Others are going to die back to the crown, and then they're going to grow new shoots, new foliage, etc. in the spring and summer. So looking at coneflowers, these are actually a native plant. They're very carefree once established. They do prefer sun, but they're tolerant of part shade. So just a little note, whenever you see something that's described as sun part shade, usually what that means is that the plant is going to do better when it's in a full sun condition, but it can still live and be productive in part shade. It just might not grow as large or have as many flowers. Many interesting varieties of coneflowers are available. Certainly that classic purple color, which I don't actually have up here as well, but I'm sure you guys have seen those. They're pretty common. Both the flowers and the seed heads are beautiful. So you can enjoy the flowers, and then if you choose, you can leave the seed heads to dry. The birds love them as well. Coneflower, also known as echinacea, is actually an herb, and there are many medicinal uses. Daylilies, another really carefree plant afflicted by very, very few pests and diseases. These are another one that do prefer sun, but are also tolerant of shade. Out of all of the daylily varieties, the kind of classic naturalized orange daylilies that we see everywhere around the state, those are probably some of the most tolerant to part shade conditions compared to some of the hybridized variations that you'll find at nurseries. These are going to tend to naturalize over time or spread out in an area that they like. And again, they have few pest or disease problems. Again, looking at some options for shade locations, Columbine. These are a great native naturalizer for woodland gardens. Their natural habitat is essentially at the edge of woodlands in the dappled light. So that's where they tend to do best. They have long-lasting, beautiful blooms. Many people don't think of columbines as something to put in a cut flower arrangement, but columbines can actually last for up to 3 weeks in an arrangement. So certainly a great one for that. Another one that takes very little maintenance once they're established. Salvia, also known as perennial sage. These are going to typically come in blue or purple varieties. They make lovely spikes of flowers a couple of times a year. So they are going to tend to bloom early in the summer. If you cut back or deadhead your salvia plants, you'll get another nice flush of blooms a little later in the summer. These are beloved by pollinators. Again, easy to grow and care for. These are really easy to propagate by dividing. I actually have a couple of sort of accidental leftover salvia patches at home where I had tried to move a salvia plant from one location to another, and just enough of the root system survived in the original location that a new plant popped up there, or part of the old plant, I should say. So these are really easy to separate and spread out throughout your yard. All right, bleeding heart, another great shade plant. These have really unique and characteristic heart-shaped flowers. They bloom late in the spring. Do note with bleeding heart, it is fairly common for them to look pretty harshed on by the time it gets really hot in the summer. So don't think that the plant has permanently died or that it's sick, but if it starts to really die back and wither late July, that is pretty normal for this plant's life cycle. Hostas, these are definitely a ubiquitous plant, right? They're pretty much everywhere that we go. And that's because they're so easy to take care of. These do really well in part shade to shade. There are now many varieties of hosta that can also tolerate sunshine. They offer interesting foliage almost all season. They do have blooms. Usually the blooms, like there's one picture down below here, they're fairly understated, but they can add beauty as well. Hostas also do great underneath trees and in dry, shady areas, and those are actually really tough spots to find plants that will thrive in those types of conditions. Hens and Chicks, another favorite of mine. These are great for succulent gardens, rock gardens, and or xeriscaping. So again, that idea of creating a garden space that really doesn't require any watering on our part. So chicks can be detached from the hen, the mother plant, and create their own new plants. I've actually had chicks kind of accidentally get detached from the mother plant and just land somewhere in a garden bed and root down and become their own hen and make a bunch of chicks. So again, very easy to care for and to transplant. They're great for containers. They have a pretty shallow root system, so easy to thrive in those areas. They do like full sun as well, but they're another one that will also tolerate part shade conditions. Daffodils, these are blooming right now, right? So these naturalize easily and return year after year. They definitely bring that really nice pop of color at this time of year when things are just starting to green up and bloom. Tons of different varieties available. One of my favorite things about daffodils is that narcissus daffodils are actually toxic to critters. So a lot of bulbs are basically like hors d'oeuvres for gophers, voles, burrowing animals. I know that unfortunately I've had a couple of years where I've planted a ton of bulbs and then only had a handful of them come up the following season because of animal activity and animals eating them. So daffodils are one that you can plant and that are basically going to go untouched. You can even try a trick if you love growing other types of bulbs, tulips, things like that that are really vulnerable to being attacked and eaten by critters. You can try interplanting daffodils with them to help repel the animals. Grape Hyacinth, so fun. Looks almost like they came out of a Dr. Seuss book, right? They naturalize easily. They're also beloved by pollinators. They bloom mid to late spring, and they're another great one to grow in containers. Let's talk a little bit about herbs, another common and fun thing to grow. A lot of herbs do great in containers as well. Many annual varieties of herbs include basil, cilantro, dill, and some of our sages. Perennial varieties include oregano, thyme, hyssop, salvia, lavender, and rosemary. Obviously, a lot of us like herbs because we can eat them either fresh or dried, but they can also be ornamental. Some herbs have really beautiful flowers or just neat foliage that we can enjoy. So here we've got, this is some hyssop. This is a type of mint, one of the members of the mint family called balm dragonhead. And then up in our right-hand corner, we've got some borage pictured there as well. So talking a little bit about vegetables, definitely don't be intimidated by the idea of growing vegetables. It really can be very easy and fun. It's just all about knowing what to start with and how to take care of your plants. So this can be really rewarding, nutritious, and delicious. There is nothing like a homegrown or a locally grown piece of produce to me compared to what we can often get at the grocery store. Growing them could possibly make them more appealing for picky eaters. So whether that's you, it's okay to admit it, or your kiddos. If you've got somebody in your family who struggles with eating vegetables, try growing them, because sometimes being a part of that process makes it more exciting and might make it more conducive for trying some of those veggies. Many types, again, really easy to grow. We can even grow a lot of these things, even tomatoes, in containers. So don't let that limit you. Most types are going to require regular watering and feeding. Again, if we're asking the plant to produce something for us, tomatoes, peppers, etc., that's going to take a lot of nutrients to basically build those fruits. So we want to make sure we're giving those to the plant. Just a few pictures here of some things that I've grown in my garden, kind of up in the center, this variety of cherry tomato. This is called Sunrise Bumblebee. That is one of my favorites. Garlic, another easy one to grow. We treat that like a bulb essentially and plant that in the fall. Cucumbers, and then also this bin with some different bell peppers, hot peppers, and cherry tomatoes. Like I said, all of these things except for the garlic were grown in containers. Fruits, another one not to be intimidated by. These can also be rewarding and really tasty to grow. There are annual and perennial varieties, all the way from small plants that we think of like strawberries up to full trees like apple trees. Many types can thrive with little care. Many of the easiest types to grow are things that are native. So we think about things like raspberries, apples. Container varieties are available even for fruits like melons, which traditionally need a lot of space because of their feet-long vines. But now there are cultivars that do well and thrive in containers. So easiest things to start with are going to include berries, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, figs, apples, peaches, cherries, and melons. And just a few snapshots of some locally grown items. All right, moving on to talking about how we keep our gardens healthy. This is such a big piece of gardening and having it be enjoyable. So as we talked about before, really one of the biggest things that I can stress is that you are going to have a much, much healthier garden right out of the gate if you give plants the basic things that they need. So like we were talking about, if you've got plants that need full sun, don't plant them in a shady spot. Make sure you're not letting your plants dry out. They're not sitting in water. Are they getting enough fertilizer? All of these things are going to help the plant to fend off pests and diseases that might otherwise attack it. Think of plants that's having immune systems just like people do, and if we're meeting their basic needs, they're going to be able to stay healthier in the long run. So other things we can do, we want to avoid overcrowding our plants, plan for growth. And I think that's an easy mistake to make when we're starting out, especially with perennials. You want to make sure you know what the full size of the plant is going to be, so that things aren't starting to grow into each other within the future seasons. Even on a yearly basis with your annuals, again, we want things obviously to look nice and full and healthy and lush, but make sure not to plant things too close together. That can decrease circulation around plants and contribute to fungal issues. Again, we want to keep plants hydrated, but not saturated. If you're growing any sort of vegetables, make sure to try to rotate your crops. Don't grow the same thing in the same spot for more than a couple years in a row. All crops have their own pests and diseases that they're going to tend to be more vulnerable to. So try to make sure that you're growing different things in those same spots in consecutive years. We also want to manage weeds in our garden beds and plantings. Again, to me, a weed is only a weed if it's somewhere we don't want it, right? There's nothing wrong with clover or dandelions, and I actually let those things live right in my lawn. They offer benefits for pollinators, so I just leave them. But certainly we don't want things in our garden beds that are going to compete with the plants we're trying to grow for nutrients, for water, so pull them out of there. Weeds can even spread disease and insects to the plants in your bed, so get them out of there. Use a mulch or a ground cover. That certainly helps with managing weeds. I can't remember who said it, but nature abhors a void. Basically, anywhere you've got open space, if you don't put something there, nature will, whether it's weeds or some sort of ground cover that creeps in. So put mulch there, or again, use a ground cover of your choosing. Plant helpful companion plants like marigolds, nasturtiums, herbs, and calendula. And then also keep your garden areas tidy. You want to remove dead or diseased plant matter. If you had a plant or have a plant that does have an active insect or disease problem, remove the material and take it really far back in the woods. Don't even put it in your compost pile. Get it out of your area. So sometimes even when we do everything that we can to meet our plants' basic needs and keep our garden healthy, we do have pest or disease problems. So what can we do when those things happen? Best strategy is to practice what we call integrated pest management, or IPM. You guys may have heard of that before. These are basically what the steps of IPM are. So first we want to make sure to accurately identify what it is that we're dealing with. This is one of the most important parts. We don't just want to say, hey, there's an insect on my plant, so I'm just going to spray a broad-based insecticide. We want to try to figure out exactly what it is that's afflicting our plants or our garden. Then we want to educate ourselves about the culprit. UNH Cooperative Extension, again, great resource for that. Technology, use it. The internet is a wealth of information. Once you know what something is, you can look up all of the ins and outs of it right online. Then we're going to monitor the situation. See what's happening. Is the problem escalating? Does it seem to be subsiding? Just continue to check that. You do want to decide when you've passed an acceptable loss or damage limit. And then you're going to choose the most targeted, least broadly impactful method of treatment that you can. So again, something that's really just trying to specifically address the issue that you're having with the plant, and that will minimally impact other insects, other plants, etc. Then we're going to assess the results. Know that it is normal, especially when we're using more natural treatments. We're not aiming for total elimination when we treat these things. We're aiming for management and control, but sometimes follow-up treatments are necessary to get there. So I'll get on my soapbox for just a moment here. Just keep in mind, again, your garden doesn't exist in a void, right? Even if you take all of the precautions and do everything that you can in your garden, you might live right near the woods, and there are insects that could come from there, diseases that could move into your yard from there. So try to, I guess, don't go for perfection. Know that, again, your garden exists in nature, and it's natural to have some of these things pop up in your garden from time to time. And so keep that in mind, and think about the fact that not all pest or disease situations are going to require some type of intervention. There might be times when it's okay just to let things be, and or to try to find some sort of happy compromise. So a couple of examples that I would share, down here at the bottom, you can see pictures. The first couple are of hornworms, which, if any of you have encountered them before, can absolutely devastate plants in the nightshade family. So these are tomatoes, peppers, tobacco plants. Not that maybe as many of us are growing those, but those are all really vulnerable to hornworms. However, hornworms complete their life cycle as a beautiful sphinx moth, which is a pollinator that most people enjoy seeing. And so what I tend to do, instead of just killing the hornworms, I actually take them off of my tomato or pepper plants, and I move them onto some wild nightshade plants that are basically growing next to my compost pile. They're not going to crawl back and attack my tomatoes. They're going to stay on those nightshade plants, and then they can complete their life cycle and become the beautiful moth that they're meant to be. Right hand side here, you can also see another example, really hallmark markings of our monarch caterpillar on a milkweed plant here. A butterfly weed, excuse me, on a butterfly weed plant. So if we didn't know that this caterpillar was a monarch, we might think that it's just something else that we need to spray or pick off or destroy. But that would be really, really sad, because again, it becomes a beautiful butterfly at the end of its life cycle. And that's actually why a lot of people plant butterfly weed. So that wouldn't be an insect that we would want to kill because it's eating the plants. We put the plants there for it. You can actually also see on this picture of the butterfly weed, that particular butterfly weed also has white fly. So this is a small soft-bodied insect that can cause problems on some of our plants. I'm feeding basically this butterfly weed to caterpillars, it's there for that purpose. I'm certainly not going to worry about treating for the whitefly. So again, you can kind of see these are just a couple of examples of times when we would just leave things as is. The butterfly weed is going to come back just fine this season. It will be okay. And so again, there's really no reason to take treatment here. Do keep in mind anytime you use any sort of methods to manage diseases or pests, it can have unintended consequences, excuse me, for the ecosystem. So a few natural pest control methods. These are just some suggestions that require no chemicals at all and can help combat common issues that you might see in your garden. So for things like aphids, whiteflies, spider mites, any of those really small, soft-bodied insects that like to suck the juice out of the cells on the leaves of your plant. You can try blasting the underside of your plant leaves with a strong spray from a hose. That can actually help to knock off small insects and their eggs. You'll notice I said underside of the plant leaves. That is where you're going to tend to have the most insect activity. They're hiding down there from you instead of staying up on top of the leaves. You can also even try a spray that's made of 1 quart of water and 1 teaspoon of soap. That can actually smother some of those really teeny tiny little insects. Pruning and thinning our plants that tend to develop powdery mildew. This is another classic kind of fungal issue that we have here in New Hampshire. That can help with air circulation. I have a couple of plants in my garden that kind of no matter what I do, by the time the end of August hits, they get a little bit of powdery mildew. So I just try my best to make sure to cut off or back the pieces that are the worst afflicted and to make sure that there's adequate air circulation around the remainder. So this is things like bee balm. That's the one in my yard that I always seem to have issues with powdery mildew with. Again, it doesn't, it's not so bad that it really hurts the plant. And so I don't take too many steps to try to manage it beyond that. We can also use a spray of 1 quart, 4 parts water and 1 part raw milk. I believe Cornell University has done studies with that mixture, and they've found that that can also help to manage powdery mildew, as well as other common fungal issues that affect things like roses, like black spot. The bacteria in that raw milk can have a beneficial effect in fighting against the fungus. So best way to manage any sort of large beetles and insects, just pick them off. So things like hornworms, potato beetles, Japanese beetles. We don't need to use a bunch of chemicals to get rid of these guys. We can literally pluck them off. So try to do this early in the morning when the insects are less active and less likely to fly away on you, and just drop them right into a soapy bucket of water and you'll be good to go. You can also use plant fabric or mesh. This can help to protect crops from insects and animals. Like I said, we have companion plants. We talked about a few of them: Nasturtiums, Petunias, Calendula, marigolds. These can all deter different types of insects and animals. And then removing any sort of badly diseased or infested plants early. You know, if we find something that, you know, is coated with aphids, it's an annual that's not going to make it, go ahead and just throw that out. Don't try to treat it if it's really that bad, because you're just going to increase the chances that whatever is going on with that plant is going to spread to other plants around it. So it's kind of cutting your losses, so to speak. So kind of going into our last part of the presentation here. So this is Save the Bees. So basically, how can we be good stewards of nature out in our garden? And it's not just bees, it's all pollinators and really all beneficial insects. Like we've got great picture of this dragonfly over here. If you don't know, dragonflies eat mosquitoes. Yay for that. We want to keep those guys around, right? So bees, other pollinators, and other beneficial insects, they're vulnerable. We've got pollution, spraying of pesticides, a lot of natural habitats or native plants that these beneficial insects like or need to thrive are reducing. So we want to try to avoid broad-based pesticides at all costs. If you do need to use any sort of spray to treat either a fungal issue or an insect issue, even if it's something that's listed as being bee friendly or bee safe, try to make sure that you're using that spray early in the morning or late at night, basically before or after the time that bees are active. And as we mentioned before, most of the insect activity that we're trying to eliminate is going to be happening on the underside of the leaves. And so that's where you want to concentrate the spray. We don't need to spray the flowers on the plant. Again, we're going to use that integrated pest management strategy to target and treat specific issues. Try to have some native plants available in your garden if you can. These are going to offer food and or shelter for different beneficial insects. Some examples would be our milkweeds or butterfly weeds. You know, those are great food sources for butterfly larvae, the caterpillars. And then native grasses can actually also be shelters or nesting areas for full-grown butterflies. Bees, when we think about trying to put flowers in our garden that are going to offer something for bees, we want to try to choose flowers that are flat, that have a nice single layer of petals, and that are basically the natural or closer to the natural variety or version of that flower. That's what bees are going to best recognize. Having just that single layer of flat petals is also going to make it really easy for the bee to be able to collect the pollen. A lot of the cool kind of frilly, triple, double petaled flower varieties out there are beautiful, but again, they make it a little bit harder for the bees to get what they need from it. You also want to think about trying to select an array of plants that are going to allow bees to find blooms all season. So, you know, thinking of things that are going to bloom early in the spring all the way until late fall. So here are just a few pictures of some bees taken from out in my garden, and I will say that is probably one of my biggest joys with gardening, is being able to watch all the different bees and butterflies and things that are thriving out there. Pictures of a few different types of butterflies I've seen in the yard as well. All right, awesome. So coming to other resources. So again, the internet offers so much. There are really tons and tons of great resources out there. This is certainly not a be-all, end-all list. These are just some of my favorite places to go when I'm either looking to make purchases or looking for information. So we mentioned UNH Cooperative Extension earlier. Like I said, they're right here in our state. They know the types of pests and diseases that we deal with. They know, I don't want to say the typical conditions. Everybody's yard has kind of their own microclimate, but they know about the local conditions. They know what plants are going to do best here. So they're a really, really great resource. Like I said, you can get your soil tested through them. If you're having a problem with a plant and you can't identify what's going on, they can help you with identification. So they're a really great spot to check out. Dave's Garden, one of my favorite parts of this Dave's Garden website is that they have a really, really extensive plant library. So you can basically go on and not only look for a specific type of plant, but actually specific variations of types of plant. They've got it pretty dialed down so that you can get information on what that plant likes, on what zone it lives in, on how you should care for it. National Gardening Association, ton of great topics under their site. Baker Creek Seeds and Fedco Seeds are both two seed suppliers that I purchase from every year. They've got really great varieties, heirloom stuff. Fedco in particular, they're actually up in Maine, so they tend to stock a lot of things that do well in our Northeast climate. Prairie Moon Nursery, they specialize in native plants. So if kind of talking about pollinators and native plants kind of struck a chord in you and that's something that you're really interested in, check their site out. They have plants that you can plant. They also have seeds, so you can start your own natives and grow them in your garden. Breck's bulbs, ton of great fall and summer bulbs, as well as some perennials for purchase online. And then last but not least, Gardener's Supply. They have a wide variety of gardening products, beds, tools, soils, kind of you name it, and they're right over in Burlington, Vermont, as a matter of fact. So that is pretty much all I've got for you today. I'm so appreciative that you spent some time to go through this presentation with me. And like I said, I hope that whether you're just starting out with gardening or whether you've been doing it for a little while, that you got something out of today. All right. So please feel free, if you have any questions about anything I went through today, I'm happy to try to answer them or just to point you in the direction of a resource that could help. Please feel free to reach out to me at kwelch@graniteymca.org. I'm also happy to share the PowerPoint if you would like to have that for yourself as well. Like I said, thanks so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Happy gardening.